This is MUSICORONA, composers in times of crisis and adversity. I'm Robert Carl, and now that we have come to the end of our historical journey, a brief epilogue. From the history we have encountered, the case studies, the musical examples, the composer biographies, there are, I think, a few lessons that we can take with ourselves as composers or creative artists of any sort, confronting a situation that is difficult and feels unprecedented. I think one thing to remember is that the lesson of history says you are not alone. There have been, over centuries, composers who had to shift their practice to adapt to changing times and to enormous challenges. I'd like to outline a few of the strategies I think composers have taken and can continue to take. First is to be adaptable and to embrace practicality, to accept circumstances and then use what exists in those circumstances to one's own benefit. We heard the story of Heinrich Schütz in the 17th century and how he dealt with the lack of musicians in a culture where an enormous amount of people had just been killed via war. And of course, there's also Stravinsky, the old fox, who found himself waiting out World War I in Switzerland and deciding to write a little piece that would be a kind of pocket music theater work that could travel around. And as a result, he wrote a masterpiece, L'Histoire de Soldat, which also became a prototype for all sorts of inventive, mixed small ensemble works for the entire 20th century into our own time. So practicality. There's a lot that is at our fingertips now that we can use to our benefit. I'm going to come back to some of these final takeaways at the very end. Another approach is nostalgia. Now and then it has a bad reputation, but frankly, to look back on a time which all of a sudden feels like something of a golden age and to celebrate it, to memorialize it, to maybe even encase it a bit in amber, I don't think is a bad thing. It reminds us of things that we treasure, that we value, and that hopefully may have some return, or probably in a very altered state. Ravel, who you're hearing in the background right now, I think is a classic example of this. A man who actually was on the front in World War I, and yet wrote music to memorialize those who were friends who died, and also memorialized a world that he loved and that he knew really would not continue in the form it had been. Another strategy is to buck up and to take a satirical stance and to bring the full force of mockery onto the situation. If we feel we are confronted with ridiculous evil, it can be political, social, it can even be purely natural. Part of the human impulse to simply look at it, laugh back, and call it for what it is, which is stupid. And what you're hearing right now in the background is Charles Mingus' Fables of Faubus, which is one of the classic works of sticking it to those who richly deserve it. And of course, there is political resistance that is a little more direct and focused, and both Nina Simone and Mark Blitzstein at this moment are singing in a sweet, discordant cacophony about how injustice needs to be confronted and routed by righteous anger. That is a welcome tonic to too much passivity, acquiescence, or hopelessness. And much of what they represent fighting for has moved forward in the proverbial arc of justice that Martin Luther King spoke of. Righteous anger, well, rage. Nothing like Diamant de Galas to give us a healthy dose of terror-inducing rage and ridicule. Rage goes just beyond resistance and mockery into territory of extreme emotion, an emotion that wants to actually wipe out the thing that is threatening us. And though that may be an illusion, at the same time, there's certainly something to be said for it. If nothing else, it has a cathartic value that we have to appreciate and that we also have to keep within us and cultivate to keep us going. And what are we going towards? Well, now and then, as the spiritual says, keep your eyes on the prize. Now and then it is victory of some sort. Victory over the thing that is causing us suffering, oppression, that is smothering our lives at that moment. And certainly, celebration is something that you hear coming much later than before from Stravinsky at the end of another world war, or from Shostakovich, his fellow diametrically opposed Russian on the other side of the Iron Curtain at the end of World War II. This is a shout that things actually can turn out all right. And this is something that music can do. Music has the capacity for joy. Maybe as much or more than any other art form. It's worth thinking about joy. And finally, there are different categories of thinking about things that are beyond. One of them is pure escape. You hear Sun Ra right now, and for him and his orchestra, it was a vision of a world beyond this one, a world where black people actually had their own world that they controlled. It was in outer space, but it's really sort of like another version of Wakanda. And then, in terms of the freaks of the 60s, hearing wooden ships says, "We are leaving, you don't need us," and off into kind of promised land. The folks who have been fighting the war, fighting injustice, just sail away. Yes, it's escapism, but now and then you probably need to have a vision of something to escape to, an escape route. And that thing to escape to, well, when you look earlier in the century, in the America that was grappling with the Great Depression, which is maybe much closer to comfort now for us at this moment in 2020. Harold Arlen's Somewhere Over the Rainbow, the pastoral vision of Virgil Thompson. These are visions of home. And as the song says, there's no place like home. And of course, there can also be visions of something that go far beyond the imaginable until it is imagined in art. And that might be well represented by Messiaen throughout his entire life and his entire career, but certainly to write music of such heartbreaking purity, stillness, beauty, a transcendence of love in search of a kind of beneficent absolute. That is embodied in this music from Quartet for the End of Time and written in the very darkest days of internment of a German POW camp. And now, before we come to the very end, I need to give a few footnotes to this series. It's been concentrating on composers, and as someone who also has a life in academia, I realize that I have not been citing all the performers that we have been hearing, except in rare cases where it's essential to the story of the music. I'd like to make it clear that all the examples that you have heard, except for one that was given to me by the composer himself, are coming from YouTube and hence all freely available to the public. This series was never meant in any way to be monetized. It is forever free. It is devised for educational purposes, which was its original intent. It can be freely shared by anybody with anyone, and indeed I hope that is done with any or all of the episodes. If anyone does want to know what are the credits for performers, I'm happy to provide it on request. Just go to my website, robertcarlcomposer.com, and I'll send you a list. And indeed, if anyone was curious what the music that has been the background for both the introduction and the epilogue is, it is in fact by yours truly. It is one of the two movements which are interchangeable of my second symphony, Liberty and/or Death. And it's the Death movement, which back in 1992 was written as an evocation of imagery of ecological collapse. Something that unfortunately seems all the more relevant and prescient nowadays, though I take no pride in that. I'd also like to say one other thing. This has been made very much in a time of crisis, off the top of my head, using very simple resources, a couple of handy programs, a laptop, and the internet, in order to put together these podcasts. And this commentary that I have given is absolutely that. It is my opinion. I welcome response. I would only hope it might be as hopefully reasonable as I have tried to be in any of the opinions that I've given. But I also know that there are plenty of legitimate counter opinions to whatever is coming through in this series. I'm finishing this now just in the terribly tragic time of the murder of George Floyd and the attendant civil uprising which is occurring throughout the country. Things like circumstances of composition may seem kind of trivial in comparison to that. I recognize it. All I can say, we deal with what we can deal with best and try to put it to the best use. And I'm also very aware of the issue of how one negotiates the territory of trying to tell any story that is not fully one's own. I'm a white, cis, straight man. What right do I have to say anything about the black experience? In one sense, I don't. But on the other sense, if I don't include it, it seems a horrible injustice of its own, of making things far too Eurocentric in this series. Or to take another example, I was reading some criticism of Rent, which used the term straightwashing. Well, there's some truth to that. Taking not only the time of AIDS, but also the people who were most directly affected by it, and perhaps making everyone a little bit more accessible and appropriate for a mainstream audience. Maybe prettifying something that had nothing pretty about it. Point taken. And yet, I still do love the number La Vie Bohème. La Vie Bohème, La Vie Bohème. And so this brings us to the end of our journey, but of course, it's just the beginning of what is to happen in the current crisis. And of course, this crisis, the crisis of the pandemic, has now suddenly multiplied into the crisis of societal conflict and injustice that needs to be resolved. And I have to add that when I look back over what I have presented, I see a host of other things that could have been covered that I haven't. In one sense, I am terribly sad that I did not give an episode on the music of Jewish composers who were sent to their deaths during the Holocaust, the so-called Teretzin composers, who were used to some degree as show puppets by the Nazis before they were killed. This is something that honestly I know of, but I don't know enough of to have given, at least on short notice, an adequate representation. But it's something to remember, all of us, that it needs to be acknowledged in all such other cases of composers who have been in unjust imprisonment and oppression in a host of contexts need to be remembered and recognized. I mentioned at the start maybe a few lessons to take with us. I might suggest that composers, more than many musicians, have at their disposal the power now of technology to make art autonomously, to bring together artists remotely, to imagine new multimedia art forms, multidisciplinary, multi-geographic. It's time to bring all of this skill into play in a world where, for one thing, performance may be a very different beast than it has been up to this time. I would say, keep your anger, treasure your memories, gird your loins for resistance, look forward to a victory and try to imagine what it will look like. Find ways of presenting celebration without in any way denying tragedy. This is one thing that music can do. Whether it's the Mozart Requiem or Robert Johnson singing the blues, we can have music of deep sadness, and yet at the same time, when we experience it, somehow we experience joy. And perhaps we can even find some sort of transcendence. It's worth hoping for. In the end, for all of us as makers, as artists, as creators, whether we are composers, other musicians, or other disciplines, the question is, what will you do? In a way Ultimately, it doesn't matter what you do, but you and I, all of us, are going to have to do something, and do it with a sense of the urgency of the moment. Something that we've been able to maybe ignore for a while because things have been so good. Well, no longer. What are we going to do? And on that note, we're going to call it a series. Health, safety, luck, productivity, and courage to all.